In 1900, if you were holding a piece of pottery in your hand, there was a 1 in 4 chance it came from right here. This was the pottery capital of the world. Zanesville didn't just make tiles and vases. It built an industry out of Ohio clay and shipped it across the country. And before we go any further, here's where we are on the map, right in the Muskingum Valley, about an hour east of Columbus, Ohio. But look closer. Behind the Y Bridge and the old neighborhoods is a city wrestling with a century-long industrial hangover. A population down by a third, poverty rate over 26%, more than double the state average, and entire factory sites, 15 acres at a time, wiped clean or rebuilt into something else. Today, we're putting Zanesville under the lens of our 10 pillars of research to see whether the heart of Muskingum Valley is still beating or if it's just a monument to a forgotten era. I'm Alan, and today we are going there and doing that in Zanesville, Ohio. We're moving north, tracing the Muskingum River to Linden Avenue. This is the Cleveland Cliffs Zanesville Works, and to understand Pillar 1, you have to understand the endurance of this ground. Long before the pottery boom defined Zanesville, steel was already taking root along this river. By the early 1900s, mills and finishing plants were operating on the south side, built directly on the rail lines that fed the region's factories. Industrial activity on this exact footprint began in 1901 when it opened as the Muskingum Valley Sheet Steel Company. By 1905, it was absorbed into Armco, the American Rolling Mill Company, the same industrial titan that built Middletown, Ohio. For more than 120 years, this site had been the beating heart of Zanesville's heavy industry. Those rail corridors moved everything: clay, coal, steel, finished goods, tying Zanesville into the industrial spine of the Midwest. And as the 20th century unfolded, steel became one of the city's quiet workhorses. The company behind today's surviving mill, Cleveland Cliffs, goes all the way back to 1847, one of the oldest continuously operating industrial firms in the country. They began in iron ore, supplying the Great Lakes Steel Belt, and expanded as American Steel consolidated. By the time Zanesville's pottery industry was peaking, Cliffs was already a major supplier to the nation's mills. The Zanesville Works employs around 160 people and runs annealing lines, coating lines, slitting operations, and a Senzimir mill, all dedicated to producing the steels that keep America's electrical infrastructure alive. But even a survivor like this shows the scars of the Rust Belt. The workforce is a fraction of its mid-century peak, and the rail line serving it, the Ohio Central Railroad, is the anchor for Pillar 3, rail-based history. Those tracks crossing the road aren't just for show. They're the supply lines for the plant that has weathered every economic storm since the McKinley administration. But as we leave the hum of the steel mill behind and head towards Cooper Mill Road, we're about to see what happens when that kind of industrial specialization fails. Leaving the hum of the steel mill behind, we head towards the intersection of Pershing and Cooper Mill. We're driving straight into the footprint of one of Zanesville's greatest industrial empires, a company that once defined this city as much as pottery ever did. For over a century, this 15-acre site was home to the Mosaic Tile Company, at one time the largest producer of floor and wall tile in the world. Even though the buildings are gone, the scale of what happened here is impossible to ignore. Mosaic Tile was founded in 1894 by Carl Langenbeck and Herman Mueller, and by the early 20th century it had become a national powerhouse. Floor tile, wall tile, decorative tile. If it went into a school, a church, a courthouse, or a factory, there was a good chance it came from this ground. By the mid-1900s, this footprint held 23 separate buildings and employed thousands of local residents. This wasn't just a factory, it was a community engine. If you lived in this neighborhood, you either worked here or you were related to somebody who did. The surrounding blocks became known as the Tile District, a neighborhood built around the kilns, the clay yards, and the rail spurs that fed the plant. Mosaic sponsored baseball teams, community events, and shaped the housing stock around it. This place wasn't just an employer, it was a cultural anchor. But the 1960s brought a global shift Zanesville couldn't outrun. Cheaper overseas imports flooded the market. Energy costs rose, and in 1967, the kilns here finally went cold. For decades, the site sat as a decaying red brick skeleton, a massive visual for Pillar 10, low property values, until the city made the decision to wipe the slate clean. And look what's rising here today. In an irony that defines the modern Rust Belt, the site of the world-renowned tile empire is now being rebuilt as the new Muskingum County Jail. This is the ultimate intersection of Pillar 7, high crime, and Pillar 8, high poverty, in the 1900s. This land produced tiles that decorated the finest buildings in America, and in 2026, it's being repurposed to manage the social fallout of an economy that never truly recovered. And when your primary new construction is a place of detention instead of production, it tells you everything you need to know about the quality of life index in Zanesville. And leaving the heavy construction of the new jail behind, we cross into Putnam Historic District, the oldest part of Zanesville and the birthplace of its ceramic identity. If Mosaic was the giant, brush was the spark. And we're heading to 1719 Dearborn Street, the historic site of the Brush Pottery Company. This ground carries a dual lineage. Long before brush arrived, this was the home of J.B. Owens Pottery, one of the earliest and most influential ceramic manufacturers in Muskingum Valley. Owens operated here until the early 1920s, laying the industrial foundation brush would later build upon. Brush pottery formally took over in 1906 and 1907, and this site quickly became the heart of Zanesville's high art pottery movement. While Mosaic tile was mass-producing flooring for schools and courthouses, brush was making the American home beautiful. Cookie jars, planters, pastel kitchenware, and the famous Brush-McCoy collaborations, pieces that collectors still hunt for today, all came from these kilns. Workers walked from these narrow streets straight into the factory. Families passed jobs down through generations. The plant sponsored community events and shaped the identity of this district. This wasn't just a workplace, it was a cultural heart of Putnam. And unfortunately, like so many of Zanesville's potteries, brush couldn't outrun the mid-century collapse. By 1982, the original brush operation was gone. Yet, unlike the Mosaic tile site, which was wiped clean, this ground didn't die, it adapted. In the late 20th century, the site was reborn as Hearthstone Pottery, a company that kept Zanesville's stoneware tradition alive with handcrafted dinnerware and bakeware. Then in 2019, Ohio Stoneware acquired Hearthstone and continued production, making this one of the last active pottery operations in the entire region. From Owens to Brush to Hearthstone to Ohio Stoneware, this single footprint has supported more than 115 years of continuous ceramic manufacturing, a rare example of Pillar 1, adaptive industrial history. From here, we're heading deeper into Zanesville's ceramic belt, toward the Stoneware Company footprint on South Avenue, where the scale of the city's pottery empire becomes even more staggering. Leaving the survival story of Putnam behind, we head towards the South Avenue cluster, the deepest roots of the Pottery Capital. If brush was the spark, this was the industrial spine. This is the footprint of the Zanesville Stoneware Company, founded in 1887. And unlike the art pottery houses chasing trends, Stoneware was a marathon runner. 115 years on the same ground, under the same name, to the same family lineage. But the story here actually begins even earlier. In the 1870s, small stoneware shops began clustering along this corridor, taking advantage of the rich Muskingum Valley clay and the rail lines that cut through the district. By the early 1900s, these operations consolidated into the Zanesville Stoneware Company, a national powerhouse producing crocks, jugs, churns, and heavy-duty utilitarian ware that supplied American farms, factories, and households for generations. And the scale was enormous. This wasn't just a pottery plant, it was an industrial city within a city. More than 20 acres of kilns, clay yards, drying sheds, mixing houses, warehouses, and storage yards, stretching across multiple blocks. A massive beehive and tunnel kilns burned day and night. Rail cars delivered clay and coal directly to the yard, and finished stoneware left the site by the boxcar. This is Pillar 3, rail-based history in its purest form. Look at how these buildings are pinned between the road and the tracks. The Ohio Central line wasn't a neighbor, it was the artery. Millions of tons of clay came in, millions of finished crocks, jugs, and garden pots went out. But by the late 20th century, the world had changed, imports surged, energy costs soared, plastics replaced stoneware in the American kitchen and garden, and the decline of the family farm erased the market that has sustained the company for a century. When Zanesville Stoneware finally closed its doors in 2002, it had marked the end of an era that had spanned 3 different centuries. The kilns went cold, the buildings were demolished, the rail spurs were pulled up, and the once massive complex collapsed into a patchwork of empty lots and surviving structures. Today, this footprint is a clear example of Pillar 10, low property values, and Pillar 6, declining population. Many of these South Avenue structures sit in industrial stasis, the ghost of a cluster that once included Weller Pottery just blocks away. This was the industrial spine where the dirt, the rail, and the river created a global monopoly. Now the only thing moving on these tracks is the memory of an empire. From here, we head to one of the most visually striking survivors of Zanesville's industrial age, the Burnham Boiler Company site, where the architecture tells the story the pottery never could. And leaving the pottery belt of South Avenue, we follow the Licking River south to a site that represents a different kind of fire. This is the Burnham Boiler Plant, now known as Casting Solutions, one of the most imposing industrial survivors in Zanesville. While much of the city's history is a story of things that used to be, this site is rare, a living link to the industrial prime. Founded as a division of the Burnham Corporation in the early 20th century, this plant was built to meet the booming American need for heat. This wasn't the delicate art pottery of Putnam. This was the heavy, brutal work of the iron foundry. For decades, the air here was thick with molten metal, as hundreds of workers cast the massive boiler sections and radiators that heated skyscrapers of New York and the homes of the Midwest. And the architecture tells a story. Look at the roof line, the classic Sawtooth profile. This is Pillar 5, architecture in its most functional form. Those jagged peaks were designed before electric lighting was standard, with north-facing windows that flooded the foundry floor with natural light without the heat of the direct sun. In Zanesville, this is one of the best preserved examples of early industrial design still standing. Burnham chose Zanesville for one reason: infrastructure. The rail line ran directly behind the plant. The Muskingum River provided water and transport, and the city's growing industrial workforce made it the perfect place to scale production. By the 1920s and 1930s, Burnham Boiler was a major employer, shipping cast iron heating systems to schools, courthouses, factories, and homes across the country. But like every major manufacturer in the Rust Belt, Burnham eventually hit the same wall: cheaper imports, rising energy costs, and the shift away from cast iron heating systems. And by the late 20th century, the once roaring foundry fell silent. And unlike the potteries we visited, though Burnham didn't disappear, it retooled. Today, as Casting Solutions, it operates as a state-of-the-art ductile iron foundry, converting scrap metal into high-tech boiler castings. It's a rare pocket of stability in a city defined by Pillar 6, declining population, one of the few reasons the industrial spine still has a pulse. But don't let the active status fool you. The landscape along Wicken Road still bears the scars of Pillar 8, high poverty rate. The contrast is stark, a multi-million-dollar foundry standing beside the decaying remnants of a neighborhood that once housed its workforce. As we pull away from the heat of the foundry, we're headed towards another long-running industrial footprint, the Greif Brothers plant, where Zanesville's packing industry once played a quiet but essential role in the American economy. We're closing out our industrial autopsy on the southern edge of the city on Greif Road. This is the site of the Greif Brothers plant, the reason the road itself bears the family name. If the potteries were Zanesville art, this site was its armor. A place where the city didn't shape clay, it shaped the containers that moved America. The Greif story begins in Cleveland in 1877 when the Greif family opened a humble cooperage shop. Within a generation, they became the largest manufacturer of wooden barrels in the world, and when they expanded into Zanesville, they chose this location for the same reason so many other industries did. Pillar 2, water-based history. The Muskingum River made it possible to ship the heavy wooden barrels, staves, and kegs that served as the shipping containers of the 19th century. But the Greif Brothers is a master class in industrial evolution. When the wooden barrel industry collapsed under the rise of the steel drum, the company didn't die, it pivoted. And by the mid-20th century, this plant had transitioned into producing steel drums, fiber containers, and multi-wall industrial bags. If a refinery, chemical plant, or factory needed to ship something, Greif made the container that carried it. This site became a quiet but essential engine of the local economy, even after the corporate headquarters moved to Delaware, Ohio in 1951. And the location tells you everything. The rail spur behind the plant fed directly into the national freight network. Raw materials came in by the carload. Timber, steel, adhesives, and finished drums rolled out the same way. This is Pillar 3, rail-based history in a different form. Not clay and kilns, but staves, hoops, and industrial drums moving in and out by the boxcar. By the late 20th century, the global restructuring of manufacturing caught up with Greif. Automation reduced the need for regional plants. Imports undercut domestic production. And the consolidation of American industry slowly drained the workforce that once filled these buildings. Production wound down, and the site transitioned into other industrial tenants. Today, this 29,000 square foot facility is a textbook example of Pillar 1, adaptive history. The building, constructed in 1967 for high-volume logistics, still features a full drive-through bay for semi-trucks. While Greif moved on, the site remains active with companies like Cameron Custom Containers. Small but steady operations keep the industrial spine alive in a neighborhood marked by Pillar 10, low property values. And this is the end of our industrial tour. We've seen the survivors, the ghosts, and the eraseries. But to understand why Zanesville looks the way it does in 2026, we have to look at the people who lived in the shadow of these kilns and factories. So we're heading back towards the city center in the downtown to see how the industrial boom shaped the streets, storefronts, and civic heart of Zanesville. And if you've made it this far with me, consider subscribing or leaving a comment. These deep dives into Midwest stories take time to build, and your support helps keep this kind of work alive. Leaving the industrial spine behind, we follow the money. Moving from the heat of the foundries and the dust of the clay yards, into the heart of downtown Zanesville. To understand the scale of everything we've seen so far, you have to look at how that wealth was crystallized into the brick, stone, and civic pride. This is Pillar 4, local history, Pillar 5, architecture, on a grand, century-old scale. Downtown Zanesville sits on land surveyed in 1799, just 3 years after Ohio became a territory. By 1804, this was the seat of Muskingum County, and from 1810 to 1812, Zanesville served as a capital of the entire state of Ohio. A frontier capital built around a courthouse, a tavern, and a handful of brick storefronts. If the kilns and foundries built Zanesville's economy, downtown built its identity. The city's layout still reflects those early decisions. The diagonal street grid, unusual for Ohio, was designed to funnel traffic towards the river crossings, and those crossings mattered. The first bridge at this site was built in 1813, replaced by the famous Y Bridge in 1814, a structure so strange and so iconic that it became the city's calling card. This is Pillar 2, water-based history in its purest form. A downtown literally shaped by the meeting of the Licking and the Muskingum rivers. By the mid-19th century, downtown Zanesville was booming. Steamboats lined the riverbank. The National Road, America's first federally funded highway, cut straight through the business district. Hotels, banks, and dry goods stores filled the blocks around Main and Market. This was the commercial heart of the frontier city, turning industrial. Then came the pottery boom. By the mid-1800s, Zanesville was producing more ceramic goods than any city in the United States, and downtown became the showroom. Pottery barons built mansions on the hills, while workers filled the dense neighborhoods just beyond the business district. Banks financed kilns, railroads built depots, and the storefronts downtown sold everything from art pottery to farm tools. This was the era when Zanesville earned the title Pottery Capital of the World. The early 20th century brought Zanesville's version of the skyscraper age. The Masonic Temple, the Schultz Building, the courthouse expansion, the grand hotels, all symbols of a city that believed its future was limitless. Streetcars ran down Main Street, department stores anchored the corners, and the Y Bridge became a postcard icon sent across the country. But look at the upper floors of these downtown blocks. In the early 1900s, this was a 24-hour city. The Weller, Rossville, and Mosaic pottery empires didn't just build factories. They built the Seacrest Auditorium, the Zane Hotel, the Rogan, and the banks that held the capital of a global monopoly. This was a district defined by theaters, department stores, and civic ambition. Then came the second half of the 20th century. Factories closed, suburban shopping centers drained foot traffic, urban renewal demolished entire blocks in the 1960s and 70s, replacing historic buildings with parking lots and low-rise concrete. This is Pillar 10, low property values, and Pillar 6, declining population, playing out in real time. Downtown built for 50,000 people, trying to serve a city half that size. Today, downtown is a visual masterclass in civic decline and stubborn resilience. The courthouse remains a stubborn survivor, but many of the upper floors of these historic blocks have been vacant for over 40 years. You can see the industrial stasis in the boarded up windows and the faded ghost signs. The wealth that once supported 5 daily newspapers and a bustling streetcar system has largely migrated to the suburban fringes or out of the county entirely. When you walk these streets now, you're not just looking at buildings, you're looking at the skeleton of an empire. Every ornate cornice and hand-carved stone was paid for by the clay and the iron we just toured. But in 2026, the challenge isn't building new monuments, it's figuring out how to save the ones we have left. And if this story of Zanesville's rise and unraveling has meant something to you, help me keep documenting places like this with honesty and respect. Hit subscribe, hit like, share your thoughts below. Your support is what keeps these forgotten histories alive. Now let's head into the neighborhoods. Leaving Courthouse Square behind, we're stepping out of the marble and sandstone and into the lives of the people who paid for it. Because downtown Zanesville didn't rise out of civic ambition alone. It rose out of labor. Out of the kilns, out of the foundries, out of the rail yards, and out of the thousands of workers whose wages built every cornice, balcony, and carved stone we just passed. To understand this city, you can't stop at the skyline. You have to follow the money back to where the people slept after the factories went dark. You have to walk the blocks where the pottery workers lived shoulder to shoulder, where the iron workers raised families in shotgun houses, and where the pottery barons built their mansions high enough to look down on all of it. This is where Zanesville's real story lives. Not in the boardrooms or the hotel lobbies, but in the neighborhoods that fed the downtown machine. The divide between wealth and work wasn't an accident here. It was engineered into the street grid, the elevation, and the housing stock. Pillar 6, declining population, and Pillar 10, low property values, didn't start in the 1970s. They started the moment the first pottery closed and the first worker moved away. So as we leave the last of the downtown storefronts behind, we're heading into the neighborhoods to see how the industrial boom shaped the blocks and where people actually lived, and how the collapse reshaped them into what they are today. To understand what life in Zanesville looks like in 2026, we're stepping out of the neighborhoods and into the numbers. This is the Zanesville Quality of Life Index. 10 categories, weighted by impact, measured against U.S. averages, and grounded in the same transparency we've always used along our tour. First is safety. Zanesville reports 82 violent crimes a year. That's 3.29 incidents per 1,000 residents. The average for the U.S. is 4.0. So on the violent crime, Zanesville is actually slightly safer than the country as a whole. But property crime tells a different story. The city's recorded 699 property crimes, 28.05 per 1,000 residents. The U.S. average is 20. That means Zanesville's property crime rate is roughly 40% higher than the national norm. It's a split personality, low violence, high theft, a city where people aren't hurting each other as often as you might expect, but where break-ins, car thefts, and larceny remain a daily reality. Their overall score is 14 out of 25 points. Next is affordability. The median home price in Zanesville is around $140,000 compared to the U.S. average of $420,000. Rents run 40 to 50% below the national levels, and the overall cost of living is about 20% cheaper than the country as a whole. On paper, Zanesville is extremely affordable, but affordability here isn't driven by prosperity. It's driven by low demand, low wages, and decades of population loss. It's cheap because people left. Affordability score for Zanesville is 20 out of 25 points. And number 3 is education. The high school graduation rate sits around 82%, below the U.S. average of 87%. College attainment is roughly 16%, less than half the national average of 34%, and the district ranks below the state average in most performance metrics. This is a school system still recovering from the collapse of the industrial economy that once defined it. Education gets a score of 4 out of 10. And number 4 is local economy. Median household income in Zanesville is about $42,000 a year, compared to the U.S. average of $75,000. Poverty rate is roughly 25%, more than double the national rate of 12%. Job growth is flat to negative, and the economic base leans heavily on healthcare, logistics, and small manufacturing. This is a city still living in the long shadow of deindustrialization, stable enough to function, but not strong enough to grow. Local economy gets a score of 3 out of 10. Healthcare is next at number 5. Zanesville benefits from the Genesis Medical Center, a major regional hospital, but the number of physicians per capita is below the national average. In health outcomes, obesity, heart disease, diabetes all trend worse than the U.S. baseline. Access exists, outcomes lag. Score for healthcare is 6 out of 10 points. Number 6 is cleanliness. Litter, abandoned lots, and illegal dumping appear in older neighborhoods. Downtown is mixed. Clean around the courthouse, rough around the edges. Industrial remnants still dot the landscape, but they're not overwhelming. Zanesville isn't dirty, it's worn. A city carrying physical scars of long-term disinvestment. They get a score of 4 out of 7. Number 7 is amenities. Parks are decent, dining is limited but improving. Retail is dominated by suburban strip corridors. Art and culture exist. Seacrest Auditorium, local galleries, but on a small scale. Functional, not flashy. They get a score of 2 out of 4. Housing quality is number 8. Most of the housing stock predates 1950. Condition varies dramatically. Restored historic homes on one block, collapsing duplexes on the next. Vacancy rates are high in former worker neighborhoods. Quality depends entirely on where you stand. You get a score of 2 out of 3. Number 9 is infrastructure. Road quality is mixed. Bridges are aging but functional. Public transit is minimal. Water and sewer systems are adequate but old. Aging but holding on. They get a score of 2 out of 3. And last is number 10, recreation. The rivers, trails, and parks are genuine bright spots. Youth sports are strong. Nightlife is limited. Cultural events happen, but not often. Nature carries the load. They get a score of 2 out of 3. Their final score is 59 out of a possible 100 points. That puts a quality of life rating for Zanesville in the poor scale. Missed it by 1 point. When you add it all together, the crime rates, the affordability, the schools, the wages, the housing, and the scars left behind by a century of industrial rise and collapse, Zanesville lands at 59 out of 100 on the Quality of Life Index. That puts it squarely in the poor category. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. This is a city with deep roots, stubborn resilience, and a community that refuses to quit. The data shows the challenges. The people show the fight. And here's the scores if you guys want to pause the screen and read them. And in order to be transparent, here's the sources I use for this part of the video. Zanesville is a city shaped by the same forces that built America and the same forces that broke it. Industry rose, industry fell, and the people who stayed have carried the weight ever since. But even in the middle of all that loss, there's still a pulse here, a stubborn kind of resilience you only find in towns like this. If you want to follow me as I keep documenting places like Zanesville, the ones most people drive past without ever really seeing, feel free to subscribe. And if there's a town you think I should visit next, drop it in the comments. I always read them.